Hello and welcome to the CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. I'm your host, KJ Burke, Field CTO for Hybrid Infrastructure at CDW Canada. We're going to discuss data privacy and AI platforms. And joining me, I have Tyler and David from Web AI. Thanks for joining me, guys. Really appreciate you jumping in to talk to the podcast listeners. So let's start with Tyler. Tyler's the CIO and co-founder at Web AI. Welcome, Tyler. Could you please help me understand a bit about your background and your role at Web AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So just been involved with a lot of startups. So out of college, went to work with about 3 or 4 different tech forward companies, and ended up following up with David from a local college to co-found the company. And so at the company, I've been working on data science, led product for a while in engineering, and I currently oversee the innovation efforts.
Very cool. Well, thanks, Tyler. And David, so you're also with Web AI. You're the CEO and co-founder. Could you tell me a little bit about your background and your role at Web AI?
Yeah. Thanks for having us. Excited to be here. My background, definitely a tinkerer. Fell in love with computers early. Launched a web service business in college that did really well. With Ethan, one of our other co-founders, kind of doing early website hosting and templates. That got really boring, and started studying neuroscience, and then ended up studying AI. In that process, saw a major hole in the approach and felt compelled to build. So Ethan and I, our other co-founders, started building early, and led to us dropping out of school early to start Web AI. And in that, have been building neural nets and AI systems for almost a decade.
And in this, when we look at AI, that's a lot of tenure in the AI space, considering how quickly it's evolved and kind of what we're seeing. So yeah, so really appreciate you guys jumping on today. And we want to talk a little bit about data privacy and AI platforms. We're just talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we're seeing with our customers, and I know that your guys' solution and approach address a lot of those. But when we sort of look at AI, and I guess we're talking AI more from a generative AI perspective, because that's what a lot of people are really focused in on. Traditional AI has been one of those things that's been really hard to tap into. You needed, specialized skill sets. You needed specialized hardware. You needed, as you point out, neuroscience and data scientists. You had to have people who understood how to create all of that. And one of the big changes we're seeing is making that more accessible to everybody. And so, what have you seen, David, as far as access to AI tools, and how has that changed over the last couple of years with more of a focus on generative AI and more of an interest across all different organizations of all shapes and sizes?
It's great. People know what AI is now. When I started, my parents and friends and family had no idea what I was doing or why it mattered, and it was very much it was this extremely esoteric space as a whole. There was no clear value in the field of study. It felt premature for most of the market, and a little bit of like a science project that wasn't going to work. And since then, AI has now taken the world by storm. It's hard to talk to someone that doesn't know about it or isn't monitoring it as a critical component of everyday life in society. So that's great. It's great that the market's getting educated. There's a lot of tools now that are in the Gen AI space, but those tools also are super limiting. There's serious barriers still for users. The cost barrier in AI is a tremendous problem. And in that, there's a native problem with privacy. You're paying for rented time on these tools, and everything you leverage on that tool is likely being used to train the next model. And for us, it's really important to democratize access and enable more people to build with AI without a PhD in neuroscience and without extreme data science background. We want people to be able to build and create, and I think that's where we stand out in the market. There's not a lot of tools doing what we're doing today. And I think we'll see more, but someone needs to set a standard for access. And I think we're going in the right direction as we see, I think this big monolithic approach, companies are cutting costs and, losing more money. And it's a signal that the access isn't actually universal.
Yeah, it seems like there's really been a rush to create and some of those business metrics that we know we have to live with at the end of the day have been kind of set aside in this sort of gold rush mentality, which is definitely interesting. So Tyler, kind of a similar question, but when you look at the way that the perception of AI has changed, and David's talking about like people that really weren't even tied into that are now aware of what it is. They're learning about it. It's a broader acceptance and conversations. How has that perceived value among some of the customers you're talking to changed as we move from more of a traditional AI to generative AI, but also how maybe that perception of traditional AI has changed as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the really cool things we're seeing a lot of is companies, AI can't do everything, but it does enough to make people think it can. And that's kind of put everyone in a unique position to trying to understand where they can apply AI. And that's really opened up their perspective with really their entire company. They want to know where it can be applied. They don't know quite how to do it or the limitations of it. And generative AI has its own areas of application. Traditional AI has its own areas of application. And so I think the market shift, to David's earlier point, was earlier what was considered somewhat of a science fair and somewhat that was unattainable unless you could beat a human in chess, is now seen as something that's actually attainable. People can understand how it can be applied. And so it's just a lot more accepting background to that.
Yeah, and the other thing I hadn't really thought about as you guys are talking about that is really the ability when you get the tools in the hands of more people of broader sort of experience and with different needs, but they're still able to use the tools. You end up with really novel use cases. So that's something I hadn't really thought of, which is really interesting. So one of the things that we've been having conversations with customers about has been, taking AI and rather than talking about it as one big monolithic like thing, it really breaking it into, smaller pieces. And two of the ways that we've kind of had that conversation has been, focusing in on the stakeholder that we're really building the AI tools for. Maybe that's for us individually, maybe that's for a team, maybe that's for broader organizational tools, maybe that's something we're going to put external to our organization and help third parties or customers sort of deal with us. How are you seeing the conversation with your customers sort of flow, and if you think about AI for the individual, AI for the team, AI for the organization, or AI for external customers, where are you seeing momentum and where are you seeing maybe challenges for organizations to move those types of tools forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're learning a lot of bad habits right now as a market, and I think that needs to be that is a responsibility on the companies that are driving the technological advancements to help these companies navigate those habits. What you've highlighted is a really fairly nascent argument in the space, right? This idea of, wait, Anthropic's model can't solve every problem in my business, or XYZ model can't solve every problem in my business. I think we're still in the early days of brands realizing that because they haven't deployed anything yet. What's unique for us is our customers, are a wide variety from, aerospace companies to retailers to, actual consumer tech brands, right? So like different groups using this tool, and we deploy AI. So we have AI running right now on Web AI's ecosystem, right? And that's the difference. It's in the wild, running in these deployments, and generating optimization value for customers. And what our customers have found is that contextual modeling is the key of the next segment of value. So I think what Meta's doing is really incredible. If you guys have tracked 405 release, and it's just a great thing. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to see this base knowledge from these models, like this base training run is going to be commoditized completely. And all of the value, the last 10%, right, which is typically the most critical, is in the enterprise value. And the problem is these big flagship monolithic providers want that data. That's why there's all these lawsuits going on and things like that. So I think it's a unique time for enterprises to adopt contextual private models, right? So we're seeing that in very high demand, and we're working with great brands. We can't disclose those brands. Some of them, will be part of our summer update and announcements, but there's a wide variety of brands that are thinking about contextual AI and how we frame it internally. We're releasing an article about this with some benchmarks called Monolithic to Mosaic. And we're seeing mass adoption of that principle that we actually believe that, our scientists and team have really, led the forefront of creating.
So Tyler, help me understand this, because obviously we're all learning sort of AI. You guys are at the forefront doing some really interesting things. When you look at monolithic versus mosaic, what is that? How is that different than? Or help my listeners kind of understand what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a little bit off your earlier question too is, it really, the solution that people are driving for is based on their exposure to the problem space. And so every person kind of has their own ideas of where AI can be applied. And the benefit of this transition from like a monolithic model to more of a mosaic model is actually adopting the idea that AI in its creation and also in its application is probably in the subject matter expert within their own domain. And so to be able to empower the person that doesn't have a PhD to be able to create an AI solution will actually finish the unlock in capturing the value of AI. And when your base of entry is training a $100 million model or training a $1 billion model, well, you're blocking out, almost every single person outside of a few core companies, and so that's not very accessible. And because you actually lower the amount of experimentation just via deployment restrictions, right? You can't take your $1 billion model and just put it on someone else's device, because you were mentioning earlier, then they can just take the model. And so this monolithic protection, or trying to create this moat, incentivizes bad behavior, and that actually reduces the exposure to a normal person. And so the open source community is actually doing the opposite, and that is, how do we bring forward the advancements in AI? How do we put it into a normal person's hand? How do we let them experiment with it? And how do we get it deployed into applications that run on your computer? And when you get to that point, then you're able to take AI and run it in a normal environment that's offline. You could be in a submarine and have access to it. You could go into Africa and still be able to run the exact same solution. And so it's really taking this this false narrative that AI is kind of locked behind a golden key, and then breaking it down to a normal person.
Yeah, and I think that ties back into what David was talking to about the democratization, right? And so it's interesting, because I think when I think about democratization, it's making the tools available to everybody. But I think the other part you're mentioning is having everybody be able to contribute into the tools as well. That's an interesting concept I hadn't really thought about. So as we look at these tools, as you look at creating some of these AI assets that are maybe really tied into your business and that intellectual property, leveraging your data, obviously data governance becomes a big challenge. So Tyler, when you're talking to organizations about data governance, where are you starting those conversations, and how do you take account of those, but also move forward into building these solutions?
Yeah, I think the biggest part of that is it's pretty simple for us. Our platform is built edge first, and so it's on your device. It's not capturing anything else. The data doesn't leave your computer, and so there's really no concerns there, right? It's pretty straightforward. When you talk about going into a cloud environment where you're having to send all of your data, you're creating a data pipeline for someone else, and then you have to be very careful with the terms and conditions to make sure that they don't have access to alter that data, keep that data, store that data, and because of that, we have a frequent sentiment we encounter is we just aren't using this solution that's in cloud. Like predominant leaders that pioneered the space don't have adoption from core customers because they don't trust them with their data.
Yep.
And the reality is, I often tell people, if the AI model that you're interacting with is able to solve your problems right now, that's an issue because that means they're able to take that exact same expertise and give it to other people. If you want to prolong your company's value and not bleed IP, you have to limit your data exposure to external sources. Yeah. And that means that your company has to have the infrastructure to be able to capture the data, to be able to train the data, and to be able to manage that over the life cycle. And that's from now into the future. And if you're not looking at that as your perspective, you're bleeding your IP, and you're giving that to people that will capture it and will re-engineer ultimately the thing that's most important to you, and that's your team's intelligence.
Yeah, and so David, it seems like, again, as you guys are talking about, the value is really those highly valuable actions that my organization is trying to really, whether it's I'm trying to grow my business, I'm trying to market more effectively, whatever it is, that's driving the value of the organization I'm working for. Hesitancy to use data that will create tools to really focus in on that. I could see that being something where organizations, as Tyler's saying, they're going to not implement those tools. They're going to not take those actions because of that data governance. So how do you approach with the platform at Web AI? How do you allow organizations to use that critical data, allow them to innovate those critical services or build those critical tools that will drive their real business forward, as opposed to just commoditized AI tooling?
We change the paradigm when we sell a solution. What's really interesting is we have a lot of companies that say they're AI companies, but they don't actually sell AI. They sell access. And if we believe all the marketing and all these articles and that AI is the future and it's gonna eat software and eat the world, right? In that sense, why would any enterprise rent time on one?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's like the core. If you frame it from there, it gets to be a much easier conversation. So it's a difference between rent or own. And enterprises that want to be early adopters of AI and leveraging it at scale are going to choose to own. And our solution makes owning not only cost effective because of our technology that brings it to your local infrastructure, but we have state-of-the-art solutions in the tool. So our customers can build their own LLMs. They can fine-tune. We have novel training mechanisms like LIM, attention steering, best-in-class LoRa methods that we've modified with our AI team. All of these things enable someone to come into our tool and chat with an AI and walk away with a custom solution. Automatic data annotation curation. You can drag a PDF in, or a CSV, or an Excel spreadsheet, or an image, and Web AI can train on that. And you can have a conversation with it. And reducing those barriers is how you get there. And the enterprises that are building and choosing to build get to retain that IP because it all lives in their office or in their space. And what is changing is the paradigm shift from cloud to maybe local cloud or local infrastructure is really critical now. Where these companies, typically our partners will say, okay, we're all in. What hardware do we do? they ask us, and they'll source the hardware, and they're going from like a cloud solution typically to a self-hosted solution with us. And what's incredible about that is it's an ultimate paradigm shift. And I think it's also a signal of true innovation. Because if we're looking at current solutions that are leveraging, existing infrastructure, it's probably more likely than not that it's not as disruptive as it's being, painted to be.
Okay, I'm going to back up just because we use a couple of acronyms there. So LIM and LoRa.
Yeah.
Maybe just describe for everybody what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. LIM is a large infrastructure model. It's coined from our paper at WebAI. It's a novel neural net architecture that we own, and we're sharing that with our enterprises. And what LIM does is it takes the best-in-class components of LLMs or language vision models, and it enables them to run effectively and efficiently on local hardware. That model manages your tasks and knows the sensors and knows the hardware, and it's able to execute. So a good example of that would be if you have a robot in a factory. What LIM would do is LIM knows the security cameras, it knows the hardware that's available, and it makes sure the robot routes and completes tasks accordingly, all from one point in one model. So it would say, oh, my camera is obscured, but I have a security camera. It knows to use that. So it's incredibly intelligent, incredibly powerful. It's this understanding of intent and tasking. And then LoRa is a training mechanism. So QLoRa is a coined term in the space. What it does is it's a way to hot swap learnings for these models. And really all neural nets are, people that don't know as listeners, is it's a mathematical representation of the brain, typically a part of the brain or a knowledge space. So what LoRa does is it enables you to swap those learned portions very fast. So let's say you trained a model on, math. QLoRa would enable us to adjust that very fast to maybe go to physics as a rudimentary example. Those are those core technologies, and things like that start to reduce the barrier for customers that enter the AI space if they need a custom model or a custom solution.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I hadn't thought about a computer vision being tied in with a robot to, make sure there's no blind corners, make sure there's, areas. As we talk about robots, we really talk about a lot of the limitations we have as individuals, which is you're physically present in a location, but to your point, you're physically there with a camera, but being able to tie into other infrastructure to gather information and proceed with your task. That's really interesting. That's part of why I like doing the podcast. I love learning stuff like that. So very cool. So, I guess you talked a little bit about some of the barriers. We talked, do you want to own your data? Do you want to help train somebody else's model? That's an interesting one. I like the monolithic versus mosaic. That, I don't know if your marketing team came up with that or if that's an industry term I just haven't run into, but I like that as well. When we look at with all the hype around generative AI, and here we are talking about computer vision and different uses for computer vision, how has the generative AI conversation changed or maybe elevated all of the AI conversations? And so I'll throw this one to Tyler. We mentioned people that weren't engaged with AI now know what it is. You've got executives asking for it. But how are you seeing the number of conversations or the types of conversations change now that you have other parts of the business asking about AI use cases?
Yeah, I think it really is a empowering motion where before you would have run into a computer vision, humans are error prone, right? So what we say is error prone, what we recognize as error prone, everything is said with a level of confidence. And the standards around software have always been 100% or 99.9999% accuracy or resiliency. And so being able to adopt AI until just recently has been the most scrutinized process ever. And so right now you've had, if you had issues with your solution, even though they're the same issues that a human would have, those solutions just would not be acknowledged, right? You wouldn't touch them, you wouldn't get them. And what's kind of happened recently is you have everyone from the CEO to the CTO down to the person working at the conveyor belt or working at the grocery store, understanding that AI is impactful somehow, and they're starting to understand how it can be applied. In the generative sense, they're able to understand that it's able to reproduce patterns and it's able to simulate intelligence. And a lot of people aren't as familiar with computer vision or the recognition space. But similarly, being able to recognize patterns in different data formats like an image is also replicating that human intelligence. And so what we've seen is a lot more openness to I would say people who are close to the problems, being able to look at new tools, being able to suggest new solutions, being able to find optimizations, and there's a much easier path to getting there. Now, enterprise is still very in some cases political, and it's very difficult to navigate, and so adopting it isn't as easy as just ChatGPT hype making something now feasible. There is still like a validation phase, but those conversations are happening, and there's everyone has an idea of how AI can be applied, so it's really exciting to hear people feeling like software is exciting again.
Oh, interesting. And David, how has this resurgence of conversations changed that you're having with organizations, and has it, having been in this AI journey for a decade now, like what are those organizational conversations, and again, are there types of conversations you're having more now, and maybe those are exciting, maybe those are more mundane, but how has that changed for you?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. There's this, I would say everyone's baseline is much higher as far as AI education, which drastically changes the conversations you have. I think expectations have changed as well, which is a good thing for, I think, the vision space. So no one using an LLM thinks that it's 100% accurate. If they do, there's like a massive risk there in alignment and things like that. There's a lot to explain in that bridge, right? With someone saying, why did it think, this bottle or this iPhone was, a wallet? In vision, that's hard to explain. But now that people have used language models, it becomes easier to explain. Language is not precise, so it's much harder to detect where the error is. But there are errors, right? It's I would say it's more liquid in how you would grade a language model. Is it generally correct? And with vision, you can start to point back to that and say, how often does it misidentify? Is it nominal? Are we able to work through that? Or is it just a global issue that it never gets right? And typically, it's not a global issue. Typically, it's a one-off case where somebody shined a flashlight at something and it didn't detect it. So I think the tolerance in general to adopt has increased, and I think with that education, people are coming up with great ideas to leverage AI. I think in our experience, the enterprises we're talking to, we're privileged to work with the best in the world, from publicly traded companies to private companies that are just revolutionizing industry, and whether it's robotics or retail, these great companies are to a point where they can now take their ideas and actualize them, which is fun to watch, right? And we're just scratching the surface. I hear a lot of people say AI is in an internet bubble. I haven't seen a pets.com yet. I haven't seen an AI company that's not driving real value. I think our AI is it's such a big opportunity that it's hard to fathom. But it's really enabling things that we dreamed about 5 years ago.
Yeah, I had a bit of an eye-opening moment when I think there was I think it was at HP, and they had some ARM servers, and they were doing some real-time object identification using computer vision, and the eye-opening moment for me was that computer vision is not looking at a point in time; it's looking at a feed of data, and what really stood out to me was, if I know with 75% certainty that that's a person, but I'm taking that reading, multiple times a second, and I'm 75% certain, 78% certain, 82% certain, 65% certain. I can be relatively certain that that's a person, because it's triggering over and over and over again. And so that was what was interesting to me, was that initially I was more thinking of computer vision as a point in time, or like a picture that's identifying, but it's a stream of pictures. It's multiple readings a second. So I like the conversation around, computer vision, and you're right. It is predicting that is a person, but it's taking it with lots of different data points over and over and over again at a high percentage of probability that it's identified the right object. So I think that's a really good thing to understand, is that we're doing this over a period of time to do that. So in addition to some of the more mature data governance practices that organizations are taking on, what are some of the other ways, David, that organizations are protecting those data leaks, or protecting those I like to think of them as AI assets. As you're building and you're investing time, the assets become more valuable. But also, as you're investing time in your data, and you're curating your data, and you're optimizing your data, and really processing it to make it more valuable, like, everything becomes more valuable over time. And so I guess, in addition to data governance, like what are you seeing organizations do to protect those assets, whether it's data, whether it's a model, an algorithm, et cetera?
Yeah, they're minimizing the handoffs. So that's probably the number one thing we've seen, across the market. An example of a use case: we're working with a major airline, and they're tracking what's happening at the gates to help with in-plane, deplane as a process. We originally, to get this contract, we were working against, the major clouds, whoever those are, right? There's several of them. And one of the issues is you're capturing this, it's a multimodal use case, so language and vision, and you have tons of data going up that has to be ran by a model up on the cloud, and then that has to be sent back down if you're a major cloud provider. With Web AI, that all could stay right, in the airport, and all of it processed there and ran there. So now you have real time with very low latency, if any, and your risk of data leak is greatly reduced. Now somebody has to come in, hack the computer, and pull it off. It's not being sent over the wire. There's a lot of protections there, and the only thing that was getting sent out was, once determinations were made, no user data, no video feeds, etc. We're sending like a JSON file, and a JSON file is just an encrypted text doc. That's the information that the organization will need to populate a dashboard or something like that. So they're not transmitting that much. They're reducing the security exposure, right? There's less exposure when you're processing locally. And outside of reducing transmission of data, they're really being disciplined with what models they use. We're working with a lot of organizations that will not buy from certain leaders. They just won't. Whether it's in Europe, we have some great brands we're working with over there that there's a lot of red tape. They can't use some of the majors in the US. And then, as well as in the US, there's brands that are not going to upload any data, and they don't want their employees uploading data. So they have, those sites, blacklisted when you're on their Wi-Fi or on their VPN. It's just not going to happen. So we see those two as probably the most dominant mechanisms to protect data, and I think as things scale, they're going to lean more into, I think, some foundational Web3 principles to make sure things are safe and encrypted and distributed in storage. So we're sharding things, but I still think it's early for that. But that's a trend that we're picking up and seeing in the market as well.
Yeah, it seems to be a bit of an extension of kind of the zero trust methodology, but with data. It's not just about what the data is and who's accessing it, but also where are you transporting it and how are you doing that. I agree. Like, once you put data in motion, you've introduced additional attack vectors to compromise. So yeah, I think that's definitely valuable. Yeah. And I think you're also right. What's interesting there, talking about, we're really just going to send some of the metadata. We're going to send some of the outputs. We're going to help distribute that. But again, we had a project similar we were doing just some traffic patterns at a local park, and we were using computer vision to do that with the municipality. And to them, it was critical that we processed the video data at location, because they didn't want to have anybody concerned that they were have a videotape of the park, and people are there to relax. So again, we wanted the metadata around, cars speeding past the park and bicycles using the bicycle lane, and are there abnormalities and things like that.
Yep.
But to your point, we don't want to be sending all of that video data and then have some sort of privacy issues and things there. So no, it's really interesting. And then so Tyler, are organizations looking at the digital sovereignty of AI services differently than other services, right? Like when you think about, where the data, we talked about being able to keep the data more at the edge. But also with digital sovereignty, there's concerns about like who's accessing the data, how they're accessing the data. Are you finding that you're having that not just data sovereignty, but digital sovereignty conversations with your customers?
Yeah, I think it's the conversation around data has spread outside of just using a chatbot, and it's kind of encroached into everyday applications. And so everything that you're using has integrated AI into it. And so most of those have also released very intrusive privacy policies to be able to keep track of your interactions, keep track of your data, and by default they're on. And you have to go out of your way to actually opt out of sharing that information. That recently was there's a very large exposure to a company that was focused in editing photos and videos, and you couldn't sign into your account unless you agreed to the new T's and C's, and then I gave them access to go in and review and look at your data and take it. And so I think that the pattern that we've seen maybe more on a broad scale is that people are understanding their solutions as data pipelines, and now you're having to almost ensure that your employees and you personally aren't enabling them to just take everything that you're doing. And so data sovereignty is very important, but also it's like even like the applications that you use, right? Like you can't use these applications anymore. You can't do these things anymore because they take this type of information. And so I think that, we're seeing an extension of that. And I think that in the end, data is very easily created, but there is a translation process to actually make it valuable. And so raw data isn't as valuable as it is coming through some type of format that's already, giving you the beginning state and the end state. And so there's a little bit more caution that people are applying to tools that they're using.
I think a good example of that, just to give like a user example for some of the listeners, would be if you're using ChatGPT and you start with a question, and let's say you have 16 iterations, because it's not answering or solving the problem, but by the end you get to the thing you need through prompt engineering, just reiterating that it's not right. What you just did for whoever that provider was you told them your initial question, and it took X amount of time to get the right answer. So now they know how to skip that whole middle piece. And what you did is you educated their system, and you probably gave IP, you gave your experience, you were clearly an expert in that space. That's how you're able to correct the model. And those are things we're seeing, organizations just not up to do.
Yeah, and as you sort of touched on it earlier, and I was thinking an analogy is like, yeah, we could just use a calculator, but we also have to learn like how to use it and why we use it, and so there's a certain training and a growth that you want your organization to capture. It's not just about having the tool, but having how to use it effectively, how to apply it to your unique business case. No, that's interesting. So when you look at once you take away, let's say, the data locality challenge, how does that change the dynamic of organizations that are leveraging AI in the cloud, AI at the edge, AI in the co-location? So if you compared with data locality, kind of what does that makeup look like that you see organizations use? And then after you remove data locality as a challenge, how does that change the number of use cases you have at the edge or that you have in the cloud, et cetera. I'll ask David on this one.
Yeah, I think when a user knows the data is not being sent, I even think, let's say, a more consumer user that's maybe not as educated on AI and what's happening in the background, this idea of having something that's yours and on your device does change what you use it for. And I think it instantly becomes more valuable. And I think this is a bit of the adoption curve issue in AI, is I think the internet has always been this portal, to discover and learn and get information. Why apps were so successful with like the iPhone is because it was this immense personalization and ownership capacity, like for the user, where it was like, this is my app, this is on my phone. There's some sovereignty to that, right? And AI is no different. What we're seeing is people using AI for things that they would never use, some of these great providers for. They would say, I don't want that going up to the cloud. If I'm using AI, in my operating system level, I want it doing everything. I want it helping me with emails. I want it like sorting my financials. Like there's all sorts of things you can have it do when it's local. And I think that the actual TAM, it gets so much larger at that point, because when you look at enterprises and you were to interview top executives and CTOs, and you said, what are your biggest pain points? And if they wrote them on a list and you said, what are now out of those, which ones do you care about the IP generated around solving it? And they would say all of them. And so we're in this weird paradigm with enterprises where we're saying AI can solve your problem, let us do it, but also we capture all the value too as the AI company. And that's where Web AI really is set apart in this space, is we're saying, these are your pain points, let's solve them with AI. And by the way, you're generating enterprise value. We have a customer that's a large industrial partner, and they were doing inspection of pallets. And this customer would scan pallets, and they need to make sure it was the right pallet going to the right factory. Let's say it's like a battery or a lithium pallet. They can't have that go to a baby food facility. So all of these details, also making sure the pallet is safe to ship, right? Inspecting its structural efficacy. What we did is we went in and we took something that was close to 20 cents in inspection and brought it down to 4 cents in inspection. Now if you look at AI in the market today, most people that are adopting Gen AI are losing money on the feature. So they're doing it because it's an opportunity cost that they have to meet. And they're saying, I'm going to spend it, so be it, we lose money. Our customers are driving a new feature and monetizing it. And that's the power of local. You're unlocking unit economics for customers with sophisticated models, and this customer now is selling the solution they built on our platform to other manufacturers. So they created a product with AI, and this is the example of it's your AI, your data, your system, and we just want to be a tool provider. Pickaxes and shovels is a great place to be.
Yeah, I remember in one of the advancements in mining after I left the organization I was with is they actually started using drones to take video footage of stockpiles. And so you've got these massive stockpiles, and you have to estimate the amount of rock that you have there for reserve calculation or just for processing. And to your point, being able to take something that used to take somebody a day to drive around and make calculations and do a bunch of math, to turn it into a drone that can fly the whole stockpile in 15 minutes and then give you a calculation. Yeah, it drives optimization to the business, and you're right, it drives cost savings, which I think as you focus in on what the business's core needs are, and to your point, being able to leverage the critical data, that really, really critical data, that sensitive data, to optimize those things that are most important to the business. I think that's one of the big takeaways that I've got. So let's pivot a little bit to talking about platforms. I think we talked about some of the the data privacy and that, but when you look at platforms, and specifically the Web AI platform, Tyler, how does developing on a platform accelerate organizations or make it easier for organizations to adopt where maybe they've struggled leveraging maybe cloud-based tools or building it on their own?
Yeah, I think that's a very straightforward answer, and hopefully one that would be pretty easily understood too, right? It's just the cost of building it, right? So a platform is nothing more than a formatted version of the thing you're going to have to build anyway. You're either going to have your software team, you're going to have to hire ML scientists, you're going to have to hire systems architects, you're going to have to hire all of these people to be able to set up the infrastructure, to train the models, manage the life cycle of the model, which is a task of its own, being able to understand the system state or the solution state once it's actually in the wild, being able to incrementally deploy new solutions, test them, and really get the value you need out of it. So if you want, some of our customers are like, well, we could go do that ourselves. I'm like, sure, go spend $2 million and build the solution. That's totally fine, right? Well, like, there's people that want to do that, and that makes total sense. But for most people, they don't have the technical talent or the reason to spend the budget on building something that someone else has already created, and they just want to be able to buy that. So, our motion's pretty straightforward, right? We're building the tools to create AI, to manage them and monitor them and put them into deployment. And it's pretty straightforward, and there's a lot of IP we have built around that. But it's a pretty straightforward use case. So a platform is a jump start. It can get you started, 30 minutes after downloading the tool, you can have a solution running, as opposed to taking months to be able to experiment and get something into the wild.
Yeah, and I look at it from an infrastructure. It's almost like, we went from building these bespoke systems to having reference architectures, and then just being able to layer the platform and really consume on top of that. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. But you mentioned something in there. Maybe you kind of continue on managing models. So we think about these digital assets, and then one of the things we're talking about is revoking access to assets. And so when you think about managing those assets and managing the platforms and scheduling, again, how does having that platform make those tasks easier as well?
I think you got to think of it like pipelines. Right, everything's a pipeline, and when you're creating a model, you're basically creating a capture of knowledge, like at a certain point in time. And when something changes in either your operating environment, or the requirements change, or there's something new you want to be able to add, you have to be able to create a new implementation of that same knowledge. And so lifecycle management of a model, you don't just put something into deployment and call it good. You really monitor the state of the environment that you're deployed into. You monitor the needs of the deployment you're deployed into, and then you use that as a feedback loop to be able to iterate and push new models into deployment, to improve performance, to be able to implement new features, and that's an ongoing process. And so that's a whole part of its own that you need to be able to have the infrastructure in place to be able to monitor it, to be able to capture the analytics, to be able to review the operating environment that it's put into. So if you have it all together in one environment, it's pretty simple. It's just maintenance. If you don't, then you're going to be shipping something into a model, into a thing, and you have no way of monitoring it. And 2 years down the road, it could start being 50% faulty, and that's just an issue.
I think that's what people are missing too, is there's a lot of open source projects and things that are like, hey, we can ship a model across devices and it's free. There's so much more to a commercial AI solution. That model management piece, you can't just pull an open source model from Hugging Face and deploy it across 6 MacBooks and think that it's going to solve an enterprise problem. That's just not how that works. There's a lot more to that detail. And there's security, there's like alignment, there's AI safety, there's LLM guarding, there's this stay alive capability for the model, drift management to make sure when the model, is changing and, maybe it's no longer as accurate, how are you flagging that to a customer? There's all these things. And I think that's when you said $2 million earlier, and it almost in my head, I was like, yeah, right. Like there's so much more to building, a commercial AI solution, and it's why these companies are raising so much money, right? It's expensive.
Yeah, and so when you think about, so David, when you think about measuring those models, like what are some of the metrics that you're really looking at as you look at that? Because to your point, not only is there model drift, but also what I've seen is that we tend to think that more data creates a better model, but that's not always the case. And so you're not necessarily only looking at your model versus, how effective it is or how much hallucination issue is, but you also need to compare, model A versus model B and when you cut over. So what are some of the metrics that you're looking at, and how do you monitor for that efficacy?
Yeah, so lots of metrics to look at, and we'll spare the listeners from all of them, but there's like some core ones that are really important, and it's different for the model type. So if it's a multimodal model, meaning if it does vision, language, audio, there's different things you're looking for, and if it's a language model, there's different things you're looking for, or if it's a pure vision model. So our platform supports all of those. So you have to have a pretty comprehensive way to view and manage. And A, being is important, but what's more important than even that to start is having artifacts in a way where users can manage them and store them. So let's say you have a custom LLM, to keep it really simple, and it's trained on, it's an education model. One of our customers is one of the largest LMSs in the world. And they use AI for educating students. And let's say we have an LMS on physics. Curriculum changes. There's new discoveries. There's all sorts of things that happen. That model is going to be updated continually. So when we do that, is we're gonna benchmark it on the citations in the data that we reference. So we're going to say this model has to have the ability to reference the curriculum correctly without drifting, and you're able to manage that because we cite in the outputs like the actual source of the information. So if that model drifts, we can flag it, and the user can then A/B. So when you first deployed this model, before it had continuous learning or autonomous adjustments, when it's deployed, it was at 90% on this subject, and now it's 85. And these are the things that have changed by user feedback. By enabling custom models, there is a disadvantage, right, where you're letting the user influence it if they want to. So sometimes you have customers that influence the model and take it down the drain by saturating it with data. And there's a difference between useful data and data. And I think it is the quantity over quality that it gets messy. Rather, sticking to high quality data points, and if you happen to have a lot of them, it's useful.
Really easy way to think about that from like personal experience is you have one story, and then someone tells you a story, and then you have someone tell you that same story 10 different ways, right? And then you're dealing with 11 different reference points for the same story. Like which one? Well, how did the guy actually fall on the sidewalk? And what was he actually wearing? So you start overexposing these different attributes that become confusing. And once you train a model on data that's false, it is in the training data. And so at some point it will come out that it was trained on that. And so you have to make sure that what you're exposing it to is correct. And then it doesn't have additional exposure to false information around that.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do with one of our demos is I ask it, what does CDW stand for? And it always comes back with Computer Discount Warehouse, which is not like CDW is just a moniker now. It doesn't really stand for anything, but it always comes back with that because, to your point, there's enough information that the demo is pulling out of our public website that refers to Computer Discount Warehouse. So yeah, I use that as an example of, again, it's not just about having lots of data, it's about having good data. And the whole idea of autonomous learning models, that's fascinating to me as well. That's really interesting because I think you're right. The use case and the needs and the requirements are going to continue to evolve. And so how do you create a mechanism to keep updating the data while you monitor for that drift? That's a very interesting. So like Tyler, as you look at how we go forward, what do you predict as we move forward? Obviously, you're seeing growth and adoption. You guys have an organization, and you've identified some needs and some challenges that you're addressing. But But what is the state of corporate focused AI? Like, what does that look like? Do you think 6 months, a year from now?
I think that people have a much more mature understanding of how AI can solve problems, and I think that it's not gonna. It's just software, right? At some point, your workforce is going to be educated on what it does. They're going to know how they want to be able to use it. They're going to know where it's missing. And it's going to be very easy to be able to understand where computer vision is useful, where generative AI is useful, and you'll use it just like you would a camera. You'll use it just like you would Slack. It's going to have very common knowledge domains, and then I think that is going to be considered as an algorithm that people understand for innovation and how they can apply it. So I think that you're going to have your very standard interactions where, a chatbot is useful. So you make a custom chatbot for your HR applications. Almost every company can replicate that use case. Now, every company may not have a use case for one that specializes on like baking, right? That could be something that is relegated to a baker. But I think that you're going to have traditional permissions applied to it. You'll have enterprise controls connected to basically who has access to what types of knowledge, and you'll be able to follow those interactions. So right now, everyone's trying to figure out where it's applied, how it's applied, what it is, and I think that in 6 months we'll have a healthy amount of education and understanding, where no one's rushing to figure out how it's applied. They already know how it's applied, and then it's just kind of taken into account whenever you're considering either new positions, new advancements, new processes that you're trying to put into development.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I took an open source tool and my son plays a role playing game, and I loaded all of the rules books into it and said, here's a chat bot to get all your rules answers with immediately, rather than flipping through PDF pages. So yeah, I think you're right. As we get more people with hands on it, they're going to come up with more use cases. It's going to continue to raise that watermark. So David, similar question, but what are you excited about over the next couple of 6 months, a year? Where are we going, and kind of like, how does this change from your perspective?
I'm excited. I'm really excited about where we're going. I think it's an exciting time to be alive, and I have a lot of hope for our future. And I think there's going to be incredible breakthroughs. I don't think we're going to have AGI by next year. I think some people are saying that, but I think that's very unlikely. What I do think, though, is we're going to get into a really great season of enterprise adoption of AI. And this is where AI will start to get into like consumer life. And we haven't really got there yet. So, we have some tools that are coming out I'm very excited about. I think we're going to get into a season where we get away from monolithic and more into this mosaic, which is, our term you mentioned earlier. That is something that we worked on to try to frame language around. So if you haven't heard it, it's our fault. And but we're trying to get that out there. And I think I see a future where there's millions of models. And we're working on, LIM is going to be powering a lot of this, and millions of models that are contextually aware, helping, people solve really complex problems. And I think it's very likely we'll see these models talking together to solve problems and, distributing tasks accordingly. What's really unique about Web AI is we have immense hardware telemetry and topology understanding. So we understand environments and sensors. We mentioned cameras earlier with robotics. This is where you start to get into that really, almost Jarvis level AI solutions from Iron Man, where you can ask it to do something, and things on the ceiling move, and the robot walks. And I think all of this is coming, and really excited about the small piece we get to play in that. And I think there's tons of great solutions inbound, but I really think getting into this millions of models contextual system is going to create a safer AI ecosystem for people as far as alignment, as well as a booming economy for innovation.
Yeah, and I heard somebody refer to the concept of having like an Oracle foundation model that is going to behind the scenes work with a physics model and and maybe a computer vision model and all of these other, and I like to think of it as more of a conductor. I'm going to have somebody that I'm working with, but they're really conducting everything behind the scenes. Yeah. So, but I may steal your terminology. I like the monolithic versus mosaic. That's really good. And then, I'm really excited about it as well. I think there's all sorts of organizations, like yourselves that have identified challenges and come up with solutions for those challenges. And I find that really interesting because I just like solving problems. And so seeing you guys have already identified a problem, coming together with a use case and having a way to mitigate that is really interesting. So I really appreciate you guys jumping on the podcast with me today. I really appreciate your insights. I love that you guys are right at the front lines of this and moving it forward. I love the idea of democratization of the tooling and making it more readily available. If our listeners want to learn a little bit more about Web AI, maybe you guys can tell them kind of where to go. And then also if there are influencers or that there's data feeds that you guys pay attention to, I'd love to kind of hear how you guys are staying ahead of the competition from a knowledge perspective.
Yeah, reading a lot is great. I think reading as much as you can get your hands on. I think the media is doing a better job than they have in the past covering AI. Getting in the right Twitter feeds is important. Twitter has become a really good space for quick real-time education on AI. A lot of the scientists, spend their time there. As well as a lot of the companies, which I don't think people would realize. LinkedIn is also great if you're following the right people. Some really good channels. Web AI posts a lot of great content on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then, if you want to learn more about Web AI, webai.com. We have AI terminology sections. We have developer documentation, tutorials, as well as a tool that's native as a DMG that people can download and build on. Right now, we're working directly with Apple devices for that. So Windows is not supported, but if you're an Apple user, you're welcome to download the tool and give it a try. And we'll have some great features, inbound for that in the next few weeks.
Very cool. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Tyler.
I was just gonna say, if you want to jumpstart your feed on X, you can find David or myself on Twitter, and the people we follow post a lot about AI. So you can just pick and choose who you want to listen to, but it definitely is the best source of up-to-date information.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, guys. So with that, I've been your host, KJ Burke. Thanks for joining me on the CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. Thanks to all of our listeners out there. If you have a chance to rate us and give us a comment or on other topics you'd like to hear about, it'd be great to hear from you. We'll be back next month with another exciting topic, and new episodes drop the first Tuesday of every month. So until then, keep exploring, learning, innovating. And again, David and Tyler from Web AI. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, KJ.
Yep, thanks for having us.